Hello. I'm going to talk to you guys today about my three different subdisciplines that I picked that are related to my research. They are the history of local adaptation, maternal effects, and fluctuating selection. So the first one I'm going to talk about is local adaptation. I made this timeline that goes from 1895 to 2004. And like a lot of your guys' papers, almost all of my subdisciplines start with Darwin and his Origin of Species. So after he published this, there was an explosion of research into all different areas related to his publication. And one of them was how small the scale of adaptation could be. So although this term local adaptation didn't come into popular usage until much later, there were still a lot of experiments being done around this time that are related to that field. So pretty much all the studies I've been able to find from this period are centered around plants. So all these early studies are mostly plant studies. Obviously they're sessile in nature, so they're forced to adapt whatever environmental conditions they're faced with, or they're just not going to survive. So the first one that I have is from 1895. There were some early forms of reciprocal transplant experiments being done by this German guy. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce his name, Anton Kerner von Marillon. I'm going with that. He didn't really call them reciprocal transplants experiments, but in his book, The Natural History of Plants, Their Forms, Growth, Reproduction, and Distribution, he describes an experiment which he plants trees at varying elevations, and he notes these phenotypic changes that occur. He then brings the seeds home and plants them on their home site to see if these changes are permanent, and he finds out that they are definitely not. So this line of experimentation was continued by many over the following decades, and we're better able to understand the range of reactions that plants have to varying environmental conditions. And then people went with that and did more experiments afterwards. So one of the next big experiments that we have is by this Swedish guy whose name I also don't know how to pronounce, Goethe Turesson, maybe. And he published this book, The Genotypical Response of the Plant Species to the Habitat, in 1922. And he showed that variations at different sites were in fact adaptive. So that's kind of what he added to the field, is that they were adaptive. We knew that they were variations from before, but now he's telling us that they're adaptive and they're due to natural selection. This was something that hadn't been done by others before. He was also a firm believer that the basis for this variation was genetic, not phenotypic plasticity. So a lot of people were saying that at the time it was just phenotypic plasticity, but he was saying, no, there's a genetic basis as well. And during this time, there was still a lot of debate about Darwin's natural selection, and many scientists were actively researching evolution by acquired characteristics. We talked about that a lot in our class. So he kind of took the opposite view and said, no, they're genetic. And population genetic theory was developing around this time as well. He also coined the term ecotype. In this book, he talks about previous studies and the limitations, and then describes his own transplant studies done in Sweden and the conclusions that he got from these. And for the term ecotype, going back to that, what he defined that as is a population within a species that is genotypically adapted to specific environmental conditions. That was kind of the first usage of that, and he really hammered that point home. Also, I thought something interesting about his studies were that he actually planted a bunch of his birch trees at the Swedish Agricultural University, where they still live today. And they actually bloom and senesce at different times based on which direction they're going. They're in a long row. And I feel like this is kind of an interesting hallmark of common garden experiments. You can tell that these adaptations are genetic if you plant them all in the common garden and they still do their own thing. And that's exactly what they're showing with those birch trees. So I thought that was just an interesting little piece of what he did. So going on to the next one, I want to talk about Clausen, Keck, and Heisey that we talked about in class. This study was from 1941. So this is kind of during the modern synthesis. They worked together throughout the 1930s and actually over a period of 20 years. And they brought together different subfields of genetics, ecology, and systematics. They performed some of the most famous reciprocal transplant experiments, and we talked about those in class. The reason that they are so famous is because they set up an experimental design that best answered the questions that they were trying to ask. So they kind of come up with how we think of modern reciprocal transplant experiments. And so let's see, the paper that I have here is the one that we went over in class, Regional Differentiation in Plant Species, but they actually published a lot of papers together and also 5 books. So with this paper, as you guys probably remember, they had 3 different flowers that they put them at all different altitudes, and then they saw how they performed at their native sites and at their non-native sites. And kind of the conclusion that they came up with is that the plants did better at their home site than any foreign plants did at that site. But also what was interesting about this paper is we saw that it's possible for a plant to do better at a foreign site than at its home site. So that's an important part of these reciprocal transplant experiments that I'll get more into later. So the next paper that I want to go on to was Stebbins, which we also discussed in class. Okay, so that one was from 1950. And he kind of went into more detail about adaptation, local adaptation and genetics, and how it might lead to eventual speciation. Whether local adaptation is kind of the first step in speciation is still something that's up for debate. This particular book that I'm discussing here is not specifically about local adaptation, but I wanted to just include it to show how local adaptation is often thought to be that first step in the speciation process. There's still a lot of ongoing research into this. So during the same time that these experiments were going on, during kind of the modern synthesis, there was also ongoing theoretical research, like with Howard Levine. He proposed a bunch of different statistical models that contributed to local adaptation and population genetics. And then in 1966, there was a seminal book published by George C. Williams called Adaptation and Natural Selection. And he went over a bunch of different topics in addition to local adaptation. I couldn't really determine if he was the person that coined the term local adaptation. I got that impression, but I'm not completely sure about that. So during this time, the gene-centered view of evolution was being developed by himself, W.D. Hamilton, John Maynard Smith, and Richard Dawkins. And this is a view of evolution that says that genes will increase in allele frequency when their phenotypic effects promote their own propagation. So, but what did he say about local adaptation? The gene-centered view of evolution is nice and it gives a little context, but how important was his role in local adaptation? So kind of what he did is define the difference between adaptation and local adaptation. So he was looking more at the time scale to see the difference between those two things. For adaptation, you would need more of a historical background to try to determine what selection pressures cause things to be the way they are now. Whereas local adaptation, we can usually determine what selective factors are acting on the organisms by looking at the environmental conditions that they're currently in. So that was his big contribution, and many others in other subfields as well. So then from the 1930s on through the modern synthesis, a lot of work was done on local adaptation, and most of it was focused on plant systems, like I've said. There was some work done using contaminated soil to see how tolerant plants are to heavy metals. There was also an explosion of studies focused on coevolution and how it relates to local adaptation at the level of like a single organism. So think of like a single tree and all of the parasites that live on it, that kind of study. And then in 2008, there was a really good review done that talked about all the different studies that had happened over the previous decades related to host parasite systems. I don't have time to go into all of those, but I didn't just want to have this gap in the literature from the 60s to the 2000s. So in 2004, there was a large study done by Kowecki and Ebert. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. And it's a pretty famous review of local adaptation. And they kind of redefined the way that we determine if a population is locally adapted. So they reviewed a bunch of studies of reciprocal transplant experiments and common garden experiments. And they went over all their limitations and how they can make them better and kind of what they came up with and what people have followed afterwards is that they argue that we should define a population as being locally adapted if it performs better at non-native if it performs better at its native site than any other non-native plant. So a plant, basically what they're saying is there were a lot of studies that were being done that were showing that if plants were performing better at another site, then they probably weren't locally adapted. And they said that that is not true, that in fact we should define local adaptation by that plant doing better than other plants brought in at that particular site. But it's very possible that a plant may do better at a different site because the conditions of its native site are so harsh that if it gets into better conditions, it can actually perform better. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's not locally adapted. So that's where I leave off with the local adaptation in 2004 with this review paper. And like I said, they kind of redefined how we look at things. So that's where we are now. And I'm going to move on now to maternal effects. So I have about 6 here from 1909 to 1998. And just a quick review of kind of what maternal effects are in case we're not sure. They're when the phenotype of an individual is affected by the environment or the genotype of its mother. So this can lead to an increase in fitness as the individual has been prepared for the environment that it's going to face by its parent. So I didn't find a lot of information on early studies dealing with maternal effects, but I did find one paper by Carl Correns, and you may remember him as having rediscovered Mendel's work along with Hugo de Vries. And this paper that I'm talking about was published in 1909. Unfortunately, I could not find a version of it in English, but I did find some review papers that discussed what he looked at. So I can't read his original work. That's why the title there is in German, I guess. So I couldn't find the original there, but I did find some information. And he was looking at these flowers called 4 o'clocks, if you've heard of those. And they have differing leaf phenotypes. And what he noticed was that the parent of origin mattered in what the leaf phenotype was. So that was kind of an early example of that, but he didn't call that maternal effects. So the first source that I found that specifically mentions maternal effects is by Dobzhansky and Sturdivant. I think I'm saying that right. And that was from a paper in 1935 titled Maternal Effects as a Cause of the Difference Between the Reciprocal Crosses of Drosophila pseudo-obscura. I doubt I'm saying that right. Anyway, fruit flies. You know those good old fruit fly studies. So this was one of them. And in this study, they performed reciprocal crosses, and they noticed that the sex of the parent carrying a particular phenotype determined which phenotype would be present in the offspring, much like the previous study that we talked about. So after they realized this, they wondered if this was due to a cytoplasmic effect or if this was due to maternal effects. So what they did to parse those two out is they did some more crosses, and they published another paper in that same year with this information. And they determined that it was in fact due to maternal effects because they put different combinations of cytoplasm and different combinations of chromosomes to see which of the two would affect the phenotype. So when they changed the different cytoplasms, there was no obvious effect. Whereas when they changed the chromosomes, there was an obvious effect. So they said it was in fact due to maternal effects. So this is one of the early studies. And of course, they're doing all their work in the 30s during the modern synthesis. So they're bringing together the work of Mendel and Darwin and trying to kind of marry those two things together. Okay. And then kind of after or ongoing during the modern synthesis, there are various papers published about maternal effects, but nothing that seems to have like really revolutionized the field. So I just put a couple here. There was one in 1947 by Dickerson that talked about maternal effects in hogs. There's another one in 1965 by Young and Legate that talked about maternal effects in mice. And he did these experiments, or they did these experiments through the 50s and the 60s. But overall, during this period, work was mostly dominated by quantitative genetics and how to explain the emerging field of population genetics. So that didn't leave much room for maternal effects because they're pretty hard to measure, hard to quantify. So although I did find a couple papers, nothing that seemed to change the field a lot at that time. So when the field really exploded was in the 1980s. So there was a lot of work that had been done before on quantitative genetics, and now they bring together like all of this new information and synthesize it and start bringing maternal effects into the fold. And they want to see how big these effects are, and there was a lot of research done at that time. One of the biggest researchers was Bruce Riska. He worked out of the University of California, and he used mice as his model system. And he took the work that was done in the previous couple decades, and and the statistical models that came out of that time, and applied them to new concepts in evolutionary biology. His goal with all of this was to determine all of the things that affected an organism's phenotype. And of course, he noticed that maternal effects was one of those things, and it played an important role. But how important? He published a bunch of different papers on this topic with various things. He mostly had a statistical focus to his work. And throughout the 80s, he developed a lot of different, he went in a lot of different areas: quantitative genetics, maternal effects, selection, a lot of stuff like that. But this was kind of one of the big pushes in the 80s. So around that same time, another paper came out. That one was by Roach and Wolf in 1987, called Maternal Effects in Plants. And this paper, although it was a review paper, it had a huge impact on the field. And it used prior publications to conclude that maternal effects have very large effects on the phenotype of a plant. So there was a paper published in the 60s by Cockerham in 1963, and he claimed that maternal effects in plants were small and that they could be discounted completely in estimating genetic contributions. And they said that the opposite was true. So they did this review and meta-analysis, and they said that no, that's not the case. And in fact, these maternal effects have a huge effect on the phenotype of the plant. So another thing that they tried to do with this was to come up with a better experimental design to go forward with research in the future, and to not let maternal effects be like a confounding effect, but to be something important and to be taken seriously. So in 1989, all of this new work that's being done on maternal effects, there was a large paper published by Kirkpatrick and Land in 1989, The Evolution of Maternal Characters. And they kind of did what other people did, but I guess they did it better, and they applied quantitative genetics to elucidate how evolution can utilize maternal effects. So they realized, of course, that maternal effects follow non-Mendelian inheritance. They came up with a lot of different statistical models to try to explain how maternal effects fit into quantitative genetics. And another thing that they noticed that they thought was interesting was that maternal effects may be the reason that phenotypes sometimes continue to change even after the loss of the selection pressures that initially they would think caused them. And then moving on from the 1980s, in 1998, there was a huge paper published by Timothy Mousseau and Charles Fox, The Adaptive Significance of Maternal Effects. And this publication discussed how 4 different types of environmental effects experienced by the mother can influence the offspring's phenotype. They built on the work of the past 2 decades, all of the stuff that had been going on in the 80s and the 90s and the quantitative genetics before that. And they brought together ideas from all these different fields to explain how maternal effects increase an organism's phenotypic plasticity and what adaptive significance that may have. And like all the papers before it in the 80s that I talked about, it really spurred further interest in maternal effects. So that's where I left off with this topic. And going on to the next one, fluctuating selection. So I have, 7 papers here that I'd like to go over for fluctuating selection, starting in 1932 and then ending up in 2001. Okay, so the first one I'm going to talk about is evolution in Mendelian populations from Sewell Wright in 1931. And I know we definitely talked about him in class. And one thing I'd like to mention before I get into his theories is how Darwin stressed the importance of gradual, progressive line of evolution by natural selection. In particular, when it comes to fluctuating selection, I would like to point out the kind of progressive line of evolution that Darwin thought was happening. Fluctuating selection kind of says the opposite. You go back and forth between two different things. So Sewell Wright picks up on that in all the way in the 1930s during the modern synthesis. And he comes up with his shifting balance theory and adaptive landscapes that we talked about. And the views kind of begin to change on Darwin's gradualism during that time. So although Wright didn't discuss fluctuating selection per se, he did attempt to explain that a population could experience a period of maladaptation on its way to becoming more adapted due to gene flow and genetic drift. So that's those adaptive landscapes. When they're trying to reach the peak, they will have to go through a period of maladaptation, which is kind of related to fluctuating selection in a way. So I included this as one of the first papers. This definitely opened up the door for a debate about the tempo and mode of adaptation, particularly among Fisher and others involved in the modern synthesis. And there was a lot of back and forth between Fisher and Wright during this time, particularly on this topic. So going on to Fisher and Ford in 1947, they came up with this paper. They looked at all these moths, and they saw that the allele frequencies of this gene that causes spots on the wing was fluctuating from year to year. Because this single gene was dominant, they could determine that the allele frequencies simply by collecting phenotype data. So all they had to do was just count the different numbers of moths that they found. And they had an isolated population that they were working with. There were a couple thousand individuals in this population in England. So they excluded immigration as a source of variation. They were also able to conclude that the amount of fluctuation that they saw was not due to genetic drift or sampling error. And these moths actually have been continued to be surveyed for the next 60 years after that, with like a 10-year period where they didn't have any data. And the debate kind of rages on about how selection isn't impacting this particular allele frequency change. So they did notice fluctuating selection in this group, but as they've been surveyed in the future, they've seen these allele frequencies steadily decline. And so they may not be seeing that anymore. And still to this day, the agent of selection, what's causing these spots on their wings, is unknown. So Fisher and Wright went back and forth during the modern synthesis. And a paper that we read about in class also happened during the modern synthesis is this paper by Kane and Shepard about the snails that we talked about with their different coloring and banding pattern. And how, what main thing that they came up with from this paper is how distinct phenotypes can be maintained in a population. So the maintenance of these polymorphisms would not be possible without fluctuating selection, because one of the two would just go to fixation. So the selective pressure in this case is known, and it's due to predation, which we talked about extensively in class. And their study showed that wide fluctuations in relative survival differed for different morphs. So there is a fitness component to the study that I think is important. They were one of the first people, I think, to include that. And the study has become famous for that reason. It's how fitness is related to a balanced polymorphism. The next paper I'd like to discuss is from 1963, JBS Haldane and Jayakar. Hopefully I'm saying that right. And during this time in the 1960s, they came up with a lot of different statistical models to explain what they were seeing with selection and fluctuating selection, and how polymorphisms were maintained in a population. And they really furthered the field by putting a mathematical basis behind the theory and data that had been collected previously. And they could extend this to other population genetic topics. One of the things that they include in their papers is possibly inbreeding and how that's somehow related. So moving on to the 1980s, we have a paper published by John Endler. And this paper, or I'm sorry, it's a book actually, Natural Selection in the Wild by John Endler in 1986. And what he wanted to focus on was how selection worked in wild populations, not in lab experiments. So of course, there's a lot of experiments done. We were talking about the fruit fly experiments and other things like that previously. And he wanted to know how this actually worked in the wild. So if there is immigration and genetic drift and all these other things going on, how is fluctuating selection acting in the wild? So he summarized a lot of previous work, and also one of the main things that he wanted to do with this paper was to formalize definitions in the field of studying selection. So there were a lot of different definitions drifting around. One person would use one thing one way, another person would use it another way, and that makes it very hard to compare data. So he wanted to formalize definitions, and I think he accomplished that with this book because it's heavily cited. And moving on from his, during the 1980s and the 1990s, you've probably heard about this one. I think we talked about it in class, but if not, you may have heard of it anyway. So Peter and Rosemary Grant and their team are working in the Galapagos Islands, working with Darwin's finches. And they had a great example of fluctuating selection relating to the finches and their beak sizes. So there was a drought in the 1970s for a couple years, and they noticed a change in beak size at that time in the finches. The drought caused seeds to develop tougher shells, and then the finches in response developed larger beaks to be able to crack them open with. And then in 1983, so I think about 5 years after the drought, the opposite kind of happened, and there was very heavy rainfall. And this caused the seeds to be smaller with thinner shells, and then the finches, of course, developed smaller beaks in response. So the Grants have continued to work in the Galapagos, and throughout the 90s, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they've published a lot of papers with their team. And in the 90s, they noted that the beak sizes of the finches have basically gone back to where they were before this drought began in the 70s. So they saw some fluctuating selection, and now things have seemed to kind of even out again. So this is still ongoing research. I'm sure it will continue to be ongoing because it's so famous. And so I'm sure we'll see many more good examples come from that. Then the last paper that I'd like to talk about for fluctuating selection is a review and meta-analysis by Kingsolver et al. In 2001. And I thought that this paper was very influential because what they were trying to do with this one is they were trying to determine if stabilizing selection or disruptive selection were more common. So they looked at a lot of different data and a lot of different studies and made a meta-analysis, and the conclusion that they came to is that stabilizing selection is not more common and it's not stronger than disruptive selection. But they do point out that there are a lot of flaws in the studies. One of the main flaws is the sample sizes for most of them are too small to make anything statistically significant out of them. And also they call for a future of better experimental design. So that's where we leave off with this topic. And then of course I have a bunch of references in here for all three topics. And that's the end. So I look forward to hearing your guys's presentations, and hopefully mine was all right. Thank you, and I'll see you guys eventually.